Good morning and welcome. I am a United States Air Force Intelligence Weapons Officer with the Utah Air National Guard. This briefing is titled Communist China Outcompeting the United States. Security designation of this briefing is unclassified. Next. The purpose of this briefing is to raise awareness amongst U.S. corporate businesses and investors, U.S. educators, consumers, youth, and the U.S. warfighter about the growing threat authoritarian communist China poses to the Western-led world order, the national interests of the United States, U.S. national security, and U.S. homeland defense. Americans are mostly diverse and tolerant people, a melting pot of human cultures from around the world. We respect, value, and even pedestalize other cultures, such as Greek, Roman, British, French, Dutch, African, Mexican, and Brazilian cultures. We especially appreciate the cultures of our friends and partners in Asia, even China. Americans are not afraid of other cultures, but we do value our own national history, our Declaration of Independence, Constitution, rule of law, and the freedoms so many U.S. service members have laid down their lives to protect. This briefing is to acknowledge that the United States is aware that our freedoms have been and are currently under attack by the current authoritarian communist Chinese government. We also acknowledge the rising threat is not the good people of China themselves, but rather a small minority of authoritarian communists holding onto power through the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, only 6.9% of the good people of China participate in the Chinese Communist Party. This presentation is a warning that we ought not capitulate to the small minority of radical imperialist authoritarian communists who seek to influence, intimidate, bully, and jeopardize the freedom and prosperity the United States of America has brought into the world since 1776. Much of what is in this presentation may come as a surprise to the casual listener. However, the U.S. government has known about these threats from Communist China for decades. In the early 2000s, while the U.S. military was busy invading Iraq, the U.S. National Intelligence Council published a report titled Global Trends 2025, which very clearly stated that by the year 2025, China would become the world's most powerful economy, and with it likely build a large modernized military. Distracted by the global war on terror and U.S. businesses outsourcing jobs to China to increase corporate profits, the United States overlooked rising threats from authoritarian communist China until recently. Had Americans become aware of China's official goals sooner, the United States may have pursued policies earlier to better ensure U.S. national security. Next. Let's take a moment to review Communist China's official goals. By the year 2021, China wished to moderately have a prosperous society and target poverty reduction, which they've achieved. By the year 2025, China would like to level itself with the world's most advanced technological powers. And by 2035, China would like to become a modern socialist power, boosting per capita income to middle income levels and modernizing their armed forces. But please pay attention to their next two goals. By 2049, the 100th year anniversary of the People's Republic of China, Communist China wishes to lead the world in terms of composite national strength and international influence. And then by 2050, Communist China wishes to become the nation with, quote, pioneering global influence, end of quote, and build a community of common destiny with the second largest military in the world. A community of common destiny is a non-threatening way of saying that China plans to restructure the entire world order to benefit China. Now let's discuss the reason behind such aggressive imperialistic goals. Next. To achieve their aggressive goals, authoritarian communist China and allies such as Russia, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and the rising communists in Brazil seek to reshape the existing world order currently led by liberal Western-led world powers that has been in place since the end of World War II, and which has resulted in the greatest expansion of worldwide poverty reduction and prosperity witnessed throughout all of human history. In Beijing's view, the West cannot be trusted, and a U.S.-led world is not the historical norm, but a profoundly galling exception. China is a civilization that has existed for 2,000 years, and who wish to forget their century of shame and poverty and restore China's past glory. Authoritarian Communist China has a deeply rooted belief in Chinese primacy as the historical natural order of things for the world. With that belief in hand, the Chinese Communist Party's supposed mandate is to set history aright by returning China to the top of the heap and replace the United States as the most influential and powerful nation on earth. President Xi Jinping of China stated, quote, "Since the Opium Wars of the 1840s, the Chinese people have long cherished a dream of realizing a great national rejuvenation. He said that the East is rising and the West is declining, and that China will never again tolerate being bullied by any nation." Make no mistake, authoritarian Communist China is coming for the Western-led liberal world order. Will the West just roll over and allow China to overtake and reshape the existing world order? Next. Let's discuss how Communist China is achieving its goal of outcompeting the West and the United States today. Next. The ancient Chinese military philosopher Sun Tzu once wrote, quote, "Supreme excellence in warfare consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting," end of quote. His theory was that unnecessary, long, protracted wars only result in bankrupting nations and destroying their alliances. China is playing the long game and seeks to overtake the West without fighting. Despite being welcomed into the existing world order in the 1980s by the United States and Western powers, and being raised up out of poverty as a developing nation, Communist China now wishes to turn against the very same world order that helped its rapid rise into the modern era. Instead of gratitude and integration with the existing world order, or viewing Americans as partners and friends, China's national pride strives to overtake and reshape the world order so it benefits Communist China. Instead of trust and partnership with the West to continue its prosperity, Communist China is increasingly using deceit, betrayal, and intimidation against the same Western nations who had invested and facilitated China's rapid growth. American businesses trusted and integrated with China over the last 40 years. Meanwhile, China was simultaneously developing weaponry intended to combat its neighbors and Western powers. Communist China has broken trust with Western powers. In accordance with Sun Tzu's advice, Communist China has been striving to, quote, "win without fighting" against Western powers until Western powers are too weak to defend themselves economically or militarily. And their strategy has been surprisingly successful. Let's take a look at how Communist China has been achieving the goal of winning without fighting. Next. In the year 1999, two colonels from China's People's Liberation Army published a book titled Unrestricted Warfare. In their book, the Chinese military officers recommended China defeat the West through a combination of non-military means, circumventing the need for direct military action. They stated that the U.S. fails to consider the wider picture of military strategy, which includes legal and economic factors, arguing that the United States is vulnerable along these lines. Unrestricted warfare has come to mean weakening one's enemy through all the available tools of one's comprehensive national power. See some examples listed in the black box on the slide. With the exception of direct military action, especially while an adversary's military is temporarily stronger than one's own. Let's look at some potential examples of unrestricted warfare by Communist China. Next. In 2023, 18,000 Chinese nationals, mostly being military-age males and some with ties to the Chinese Communist Party and or People's Liberation Army, illegally crossed into the United States at the U.S.-Mexico border. This is a sharp increase in illegal crossings, up from just 450 in 2021 and 2,000 in 2022. None of these Chinese nationals were detained by U.S. law enforcement and were set free within the United States. In September of 2023, 5 U.S. senators wrote to the Department of Homeland Security secretary saying, quote, "These Chinese individuals could engage in espionage activities or cyber attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure, government agencies, or private sector entities," end of quote. Are Chinese saboteurs entering the United States in preparation for some future plan to destabilize the United States? Are you comfortable knowing that tens of thousands of citizens from an authoritarian communist nation whose stated goal is to overtake your country, are illegally entering and living within your country. Let's look at an example of why this might matter. Next. In July of 2023, an illegal Chinese biolab was discovered in a warehouse near Fresno, California. This illegal Chinese biolab contained over 20 infectious agents and 1,000 mice infected with various diseases and were genetically engineered to catch and carry the COVID-19 virus. The lab was only discovered when a neighbor noticed a garden hose suspiciously being run into the building. A short 43-minute drive away from this illegal Chinese biolab in California resides the United States Navy's newest and largest master fighter jet base and Strike Fighter Wing Pacific, containing carrier air wings 2, 9, 11, and 17, with Super Hornets and F-35Cs that would be used in a future conflict against China. Coincidence? Let's look at a proven example of how China weakens its enemies without fighting. Next. Back in the 1950s, one highly effective method used by Chinese communists to defeat their rival, the Chinese nationalists, who currently occupy the island of Taiwan, was the use of illegal narcotics. In the 1950s and 60s, Zhou Enlai, the first premier of Communist China, and a European-educated Chinese military officer under Mao Zedong, oversaw opium trafficking operations into the non-communist regions of China. According to Soviet statesman Mikhail Suslov in 1964, Zhao's strategy was to, quote, disarm the Chinese Nationalist Party with the things they like to taste, end of quote. Today, Communist China produces the precursor ingredients to the harmfully addictive and dangerous illegal narcotic fentanyl. China ships the ingredients to Canada and Mexico, and then into the United States to disarm American youth from becoming strong or loving, protecting, and defending their own country. Fentanyl is the #1 killer of Americans under age 50, with 162 overdoses every day. According to a Salt Lake City narcotics police officer in 2023, fentanyl is the #1 drug problem facing the state of Utah, and he stated that most of it comes through Canada from China. Is fentanyl a secret weapon of unrestricted warfare that authoritarian Chinese communists are using to destabilize America, like they did to the Chinese nationalists decades ago? In addition to getting their enemies' youth addicted to harmful narcotics, Communist China is exploiting the technology that the United States has become so dependent upon, using cyber espionage to prepare destructive cyber attacks against the U.S. homeland. Next. In June of 2013, American citizens were warned that they need to prepare themselves for the likelihood that Communist China can already attack the U.S. homeland on a moment's notice. In June of 2023, the director of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency said, quote, Beijing has made major investments in capabilities to sabotage U.S. infrastructure, end of quote. She went on saying, quote, Americans need to be prepared for the likelihood that Beijing's hackers would dodge U.S. defenses and cause damage in the physical world in the U.S. homeland, end of quote. Chinese hackers are all but certain to disrupt American critical infrastructure, such as U.S. railways, pipelines, U.S. power plants, and military bases. And China's harmful exploitation of technology doesn't stop there. Next. In addition to cyber attacks, Communist China can likely already influence the thoughts of you and your children. Leveraging the popular Chinese apps TikTok, Pinduoduo, and Temu, Communist China has access to American citizens' biometrics, Bluetooth, home Wi-Fi networks, private messages, and can bypass your device's security permissions, modify its settings, view data from other apps on your phone, and even prevent app uninstallation. Using your own digital data and online viewing history, Communist China can leverage your own social media influencers that you and your kids already perceive as highly credible. Using artificial intelligence and advanced algorithms, Communist China can subtly tailor and skew the content from your own social media influencers, subtly reducing the amount of positive content that they output and increasing the amount of negative content you and your children view about your own culture, country, or government. Over time, Communist China is able to subtly influence American minds to think negatively about their own country and even incite internal cultural hatred, such as racism riots, gender wars, political strife, questioning authority, institutions, or national elections, and promote self-harm, even encouraging suicide. In addition to psychological warfare, in 2017, the U.S. Congress changed a law increasing the dollar amount of tax-free direct-to-consumer shipments into the United States from the dollar amount of $200 up to $800. A foreign company, such as China's Temu app, can now ship even more foreign manufactured product direct to U.S. consumers tax-free. Meanwhile, U.S. companies shipping U.S. product overseas do not share the same advantages as communist Chinese companies. The country who benefits the most from this change in U.S. import law is Communist China. The vast majority of the millions of packages entering the United States tax-free every day and uninspected by U.S. Customs are coming from Communist China. As more and more American citizens buy or invest in Chinese companies or products in an attempt to find more affordable goods amidst rising inflation, they could be unwittingly investing in the development of new advanced weapon systems to be used by the People's Liberation Army, as the private and public sectors in authoritarian Communist China are deeply interwoven. As China seeks to dominate the information domain, let's look at a recent example of deceitful propaganda being put out to the global public from the Chinese communists. Next. In addition to preparing for cyber attacks or stealing your digital information and using it to influence you and your kids, Communist China has increasingly been uploading propaganda to the internet. In June of 2023, Communist China uploaded a 2-minute video onto YouTube, painting the rapidly modernizing and aggressive People's Liberation Army as, quote, a humanitarian organization. The video depicts China's military as a, quote, saintly, selfless group of missionaries, whose only intent is serving as a force for, quote, global peace. Does anyone actually believe that a rapidly expanding nation, desperate for natural resources such as oil, gas, and food and water, who indebts other nations and steals their digital data, is going to use their military for global peace? A more accurate depiction might be an imperialistic authoritarian China seeking to expand its military presence around the world to reshape the existing world order to benefit themselves, making it easier for them to secure the natural resources they need for their own national survival. One only need look at how Communist China has treated its own neighbors in the South China Sea for obvious examples of China's expansionist bullying. Look at how China mistreats Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, or Malaysia, or uses North Korea as a puppet state for their own self-interests. Is there any reason to doubt that Communist China would behave any differently around the world from how they treat their own regional neighbors? China does not play fair on the world stage. They use soft words, time, and strategy to mask their deceit, betrayal, and theft to win. Let's look at an example. Next. In addition to infiltrating American society, potential sabotage, cyber attacks, and psychological warfare, Communist China relies upon stealing other nations' intellectual property to attain their official goal stated earlier that by 2025, China will level itself with the world's most technological powers. In July of 2022, the FBI director said, China aims to ransack the intellectual property of Western companies so it can speed up its own industrial development and eventually dominate key industries. He warned China is snooping on companies everywhere, from big cities to small towns, from Fortune 100 companies down to small startup companies, folks that focus on everything from aviation to artificial intelligence to pharmaceuticals. Then in January of 2023, the Department of Justice announced that another U.S. citizen, this one named Mr. Zhang, an engineer at General Electric, hid confidential files of advanced turbine engine technology stolen from his employer in the binary code of a digital photograph of a sunset. Considered to be worth millions of dollars in research and development, the intellectual property was sent to his accomplice in China, and would ultimately benefit the Chinese Communist government as well as China-based companies and universities. American businesses who are focused on global profits should recognize that authoritarian Communist China is not a moral or ethical government operating like Western governments, abiding under democratic principles or the established rule of law. In 2013, Chinese corporations were allowed to be listed on U.S. stock exchanges, but surprisingly, without having to adhere to the strict reporting requirements for U.S. investors that U.S. corporations must follow. And when U.S. companies doing business in China attempt to gather business-related information to help U.S. investors make more informed investment decisions, the Chinese government raids their offices and has them arrested. Make no mistake, China's current government is an authoritarian regime where dissenting citizens, political, or business leaders occasionally disappear. Have we forgotten that the Communist Revolution's goal was to completely eliminate the traditions of China's past, including the influence of moral codes of conduct and religion? The Chinese communists viewed China's traditions as weak and the cause of China's century of shame. The god of modern-day Communist China is national self-interest, and China has no qualms about taking any action, regardless of how egregious, if it benefits the Chinese Communist Party. China will spy, lie, steal, arrest, kidnap, bribe, intimidate, expand its borders, and kill in order to obtain power or subjugate other nations into capitulating to China's will for a new world order benefiting China. American businesses and investors may want to pause and rethink their sacrificing long-term U.S. national security and U.S. national survival in pursuit of short-term profits. The continuation of investing in China is to continue to invest in the Chinese military. Let's look at a recent example of China interfering in foreign elections of U.S. allies. Next. In April of 2023, a clandestine network of Beijing-backed Canadian political candidates was discovered. Beijing was directing funds to the Canadian politicians between 2019 and 2021 and were supported by Beijing as up to as many as 11 Canadian candidates in the Canadian federal elections. In May of 2023, the lead Canadian investigator said his government had not ignored evidence of Chinese meddling in their elections. However, this lead investigator recommended against an official public inquest. Ironically, in June of 2023, it was discovered that the lead investigator belonged to a charitable foundation that took funds from China. Communist China seeks to target and influence the elections of U.S. allies while reducing the right of voters and sovereign countries to elect their own officials. The last 9 slides were very concerning, but nothing compared to the upcoming slides. Are you ready to learn about the most serious danger of the authoritarian communists currently running the Chinese government? Communist China's new military. Next. What we see today with Communist China is the largest, most rapid peacetime military buildup and military modernization campaign our world has seen in 100 years. For the last 23 years, China has been stealing advanced weapon system technology and building their own indigenous weapon systems, bringing Communist China to par or superseding U.S. military technology in the Chinese Army, Navy, ballistic missile, nuclear, air, space, and cyber forces. The following slides will only superficially introduce you to the increasing threat Communist China's modernizing military poses to U.S. interests at home and throughout the world. Next. In the year 1999, China had a much smaller military relative to U.S. forces that were deployed to the Indo-Pacific theater, which were ensuring free and open global trade. The U.S. military far outnumbered China's military in space capabilities, advanced fighters, bombers, large naval capability, and nuclear submarines. U.S. bases throughout the entire Indo-Pacific theater were not within range of Chinese weapon systems. The People's Liberation Army could only project power from mainland China out to maybe the first island chain. But most importantly, the entire Indo-Pacific theater was free and open for global trade. Global businesses and investors could do business in Asia with confidence. Since 1999, foreign direct investment in China led to China's rapid rise, and China used its newfound wealth to invest into modernizing the Chinese military. Many U.S. investment funds still invest in Chinese companies that directly fund Communist China's military-industrial complex and weapon systems that may one day be used to take over the Indo-Pacific region and kill American citizens. The West literally has helped create China's new military. Now let's fast forward 25 years, while the U.S. was fighting a long protracted 20-year war in the Middle East. Next slide. U.S. Pacific Air Force projects that by the year 2025, China will outnumber U.S. military capabilities in the entire region and in all domains of war, even when counting the addition of U.S. allies' militaries in the region. China will soon have the ability to project military power throughout the entire Indo-Pacific region. All U.S. bases will now be under constant potential threat of attack from the Chinese military. This military posture by China is called anti-access area denial because its intent is to threaten, intimidate, and push the United States military out of the Indo-Pacific region. If the U.S. presence were to decline in the region, it is assessed that the Chinese military would become increasingly aggressive and expansionistic, and the Indo-Pacific region would no longer remain free and open for global trade, which would have disastrous impacts on the global economy, especially the U.S. economy. Let's look at a few examples of how Communist China is achieving anti-access area denial to intimidate and/or push the United States military out of the region. Next. After decades of peaceful sea superiority in the Indo-Pacific theater, the United States is now operating under continuous threat of Chinese attack. China has developed carrier-killer ballistic missiles that can target static or slow-moving targets such as U.S. aircraft carriers. For example, the DF-26B is an intermediate-range anti-ship, high hypersonic ballistic missile thought to have no known defense and is either conventional or nuclear armed. It has a range to hit targets out to a distance of 2,485 nautical miles, as seen by the yellow threat ring in the graphic to the top right. The U.S. no longer holds sea superiority in the region. Next. Another factor impacting U.S. sea superiority is that the U.S. naval fleet is quickly falling behind the Chinese Navy. A growing Chinese Navy is increasingly deploying more worldwide, as opposed to the Chinese Navy's past confinement to its coastal littoral seas. China has now surpassed the size of the naval fleet of the United States, although a larger percentage of Chinese ships are smaller naval vessels. However, China has a much larger shipbuilding capacity than the United States, with its largest of 13 shipyards having more capacity than all 7 U.S. shipyards combined, and with current plans to quickly increase the size of the Chinese Navy by another 60 ships. China can accomplish shipbuilding faster than the United States because China has more available skilled manpower and less restrictions, regulations, or economic pressures than the United States. Meanwhile, the size of the U.S. Navy is projected to actually decrease in the near term until the U.S. can build more ships. Let's look at a recent example of U.S. sea superiority being challenged. Next. On June 3, 2023, a Chinese warship, Luoyang 3, overtook the American Aegis destroyer Chang'un and then veered across its bow at a distance of just 150 yards. The Chinese ship radioed, "Move, or there will be a collision." The U.S. guided missile destroyer had no other option but to slow to 10 knots to avoid collision. China claims that the U.S. Navy's efforts to ensure freedom of navigation are a provocation to China. China's defense minister said, quote, "The best way is for countries such as the United States, especially the naval vessels and fighter jets of those countries, not to do closing actions around other countries' territories." End of quote. China's ultimate goal with these aggressive actions is to push the U.S. Navy out so the Chinese Navy can dominate the region, impair the U.S. Navy's ability to blockade China's oil and food imports and expansionist efforts, and oversee global trade throughout Asia. Now let's look at the U.S. loss of air superiority. Next slide. The U.S. military has enjoyed air superiority, or could quickly obtain it, throughout most of the world ever since World War II. That is no longer the case. Over the last 20 years, Communist China has developed a new advanced radar-guided, beyond visual range air-to-air missile that is assessed to be more capable than the United States AIM-120 AMRAAM, which has been the bread and butter of U.S. air superiority for the last 40 years. China's new air-to-air missile has a longer maximum range that can target and kill U.S. fighter jets before U.S. fighter pilots can target and kill the Chinese fighter jets. This advantage could increase Chinese fighter jet survivability, which may quickly increase their force ratio during an air-to-air engagement, making it more probable that U.S. forces might turn and run. And it's not just Chinese air-to-air missiles that are concerning. Next. In June of 2023, a video emerged of a Chinese J-20 air superiority stealth fighter jet equipped with two Xi'an-built Woshan 15 engines. This is a major milestone for China, who had been struggling for decades to develop effective fighter jet engines equivalent to U.S. fighter engine technology. With these new fighter jet engines, China's J-20 stealth fighter now has the engines to deliver the range and payload that the J-20 was designed for. This raises significant concerns for the U.S. Navy and partners in the Pacific. Let's look at another way China is extending the range or distance its military can travel. Next. Communist China has developed a new turbofan heavy transport aircraft called the Y-20 that looks strikingly similar to the U.S. C-17. With this new aircraft, China will be able to transport its military forces around the world. China has also created a variant of the Y-20 called the Y-20U, which is an air refueling tanker. The Y-20U triples China's current air refueling capability, i.e. gas, available to resupply Chinese military aircraft in the air. This new air refueler may greatly extend the force projection range of Chinese military forces throughout the Indo-Pacific and the world. Let's look at another way China might extend its military reach throughout the world. Next. Pay close attention to the red stars on the slide. These represent overseas military bases that China is building or hopes to build. We can see Cuba, Equatorial Guinea in Africa, Djibouti, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Cambodia. These are essentially areas which are very important to global trade, but where the U.S. currently has a much smaller military presence. Their location is strategic in that it provides the Chinese military the extended range to protect Chinese interests across the globe, such as ensuring the safety of Chinese oil imports from Saudi Arabia and food imports from Brazil, a country previously friendly to the United States, but whose government is rapidly turning toward communism. This slide also summarizes China's increasing worldwide influence, such as Confucius Institutes, to include locations within the United States, which are a subtle means for Communist China to spread its authoritarian ideology and eclipse U.S. liberal democratic influence abroad. Back to air superiority for a moment. Let's look at a recent example of the U.S. military's dwindling air superiority in the Indo-Pacific. Next. In May of 2023, a Chinese J-16 fighter jet dangerously intercepted a regularly scheduled, safe, and routine flight of a U.S. Air Force RC-135, which was completely unarmed, operating in international airspace over the South China Sea. The Chinese fighter jet flew directly in front of the nose of the U.S. Air Force plane. The U.S. Air Force plane was forced to fly through the wake turbulence of the Chinese fighter jet. U.S. Pacific Command said the Chinese pilot's behavior was unnecessarily aggressive. China accused the United States aircraft of deliberately intruding into a Chinese military training area. China says it owns the South China Sea virtually in its entirety, a claim not recognized internationally and in conflict with the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Beijing continues to demand an end to U.S. surveillance flights near China-claimed territory. Spokesperson Mao Ning said, quote, "The U.S.'s provocative and dangerous moves are the root cause of maritime security issues. China urges the United States to stop such dangerous provocations," end of quote. Now let's turn to how Communist China is challenging U.S. intelligence superiority. Next. In February of 2023, Communist China sent a high-altitude intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance spy balloon containing advanced signals intelligence collection sensors over the continental United States. The balloon was launched from Hainan Island in southern China, and within 1 week, the balloon, flying at an altitude of 60,000 feet, was transiting over highly sensitive U.S. nuclear sites. After shooting down the balloon off the coast of South Carolina, the U.S. has since made a statement that no intelligence of value was collected from the Chinese sensors. But this was definitely an escalation in Communist China's employment of comprehensive national power. Though this was not the first time Communist China used an intelligence spy balloon to spy on the United States, China is now emboldened to violate U.S. airspace. The official response from Communist China to the U.S. shooting down their spy balloon over the United States was, quote, "The spy balloon was destined for Hawaii but blew off course, and the United States will suffer consequences for destroying the balloon and violating China's national sovereignty," end of quote. This is not the only example of increasing aggressiveness from Communist China violating others' national sovereignty. Next. In April of 2023, it was revealed that authoritarian Communist China had set up an undeclared police station in New York City. The U.S. Justice Department charged 34 officers of China's national police who worked for the Chinese Military of Public Security. These Chinese secret police operating within the United States harassed and silenced Chinese critics living in the United States. For example, they flooded online video conferences and screamed at and threatened Chinese dissidents in the United States who were discussing democracy. Efforts of Communist China to export authoritarian methods to stifle free expression in the United States is a direct threat to American democracy. In addition, in June of 2023, the United Kingdom ordered China to shut unofficial police stations in Great Britain. Where else throughout the world might the Chinese secret police be operating undetected? This is only one method China uses to spy on the United States and Western territories. Let's take a look at another potential method of Chinese intelligence spying within the United States. Next. In February of 2023, it was reported that a Chinese company called the Fufeng Group desired to purchase a corn mill in North Dakota. The only problem is that the Fufeng Group has deep ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and the corn mill they wished to purchase was strategically located between two United States Air Force military bases, one an intelligence platform base, and the other a strategic command nuclear base. The United States Air Force warned the local community that such a purchase would pose a significant threat to national security, and the purchase was subsequently canceled. But how many other instances exist where Chinese businesses have purchased property within the United States to use as intelligence collection sites? Let's turn to an example of where Communist China is spying on the United States from just off the coast of Florida. Next. In June of 2023, it was revealed that Communist China has plans to build a military training facility in Cuba, as was discussed earlier in this brief. This may lead to the stationing of Chinese military troops just off the coast of the United States. The Wall Street Journal also reported an agreement of China establishing an electronic eavesdropping facility in Cuba with purpose of spying on American communications across the southeastern United States. During one of many official U.S. government envoys sent over to China in 2023 without any reciprocity of Chinese officials visiting the United States, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said he made very clear to Beijing that the United States would have deep concerns about Chinese activity in Cuba. Up to this point, we can see the incredible efforts Communist China has taken to challenge the United States of America. Now let's turn to probably the most concerning trend: Communist China's investment in artificial intelligence. Next. In July of 2023, the CEO of Scale AI, Alexander Wang, testified before the U.S. Congress, warning that artificial intelligence is China's Apollo project, a reference to the major effort the U.S. took to go to the moon in the 1960s. He stated that the Chinese government is directing the full power of its industries toward artificial intelligence, and that they are spending 3 times as much as the United States government on artificial intelligence research and development. He went on to further testify that if the U.S. does not win on artificial intelligence, we risk ceding global influence, technology leadership, and democracy to Communist China. Next. In June of 2023, Elon Musk warned that China is gunning for AI dominance, and that they are already ahead of the United States, and that they have already initiated AI regulation, whereas the United States has not. In April, the Cyberspace Administration of China released a draft called Measures for the Management of Generative Artificial Intelligence Services. To date, there has been no serious consideration of a U.S. analog to the European Union AI Act or any sweeping federal legislation to govern the use of AI in the United States, nor is there any substantial state legislation in force. According to Alexander Wang, data is the ammunition of the future. The nation who leads in artificial intelligence will win on the battlefield and ultimately rewrite the global world order to benefit their national interests. Next. If you think this unclassified briefing sounds bad, the story does not get any better at the secret or top secret classification levels. Let's listen to some warnings from top U.S. military leaders. Next. In 2021 testimony before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee, the commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM, Admiral Philip Davidson, stated, quote, "China is the greatest threat to global order and stability. The United States has lost the quantitative advantage, and our qualitative advantage was shrinking across several domains, and as the People's Liberation Army fields higher quality military weapon systems," end of quote. He said, "The greatest danger for the United States in this competition is the erosion of conventional deterrence, and that a combat-credible conventional deterrent posture in the Indo-Pacific is necessary to prevent conflict and protect U.S. interests and assure our allies and partners in the region. Absent a convincing deterrent, the Communist Chinese government will be emboldened to take action to undermine the rules-based international order and free and open Indo-Pacific." Next. Admiral Davidson went on to say that the U.S. and global economy are economically dependent upon the Indo-Pacific region. The region hosts 60% of all global domestic product production, more than 2/3 of present economic growth, and is the #1 destination for U.S. foreign direct investment. Also, 7 of the top 10 U.S. trading partners are located in the Indo-Pacific. If the Chinese military were allowed to dominate the region, think of the economic impact that would have on the United States. Next. U.S. Stratcom Commander Admiral Charles Richards said in November of 2022 that, quote, "Competitors like China are outcompeting the United States." He said, quote, "As I assess our level of deterrence against China, the ship is slowly sinking. It is sinking slowly, but it is sinking, as they are putting capability into the field faster than we are. We, the United States, used to know how to move fast. We have lost the art of that. The only advantage the United States has left is our undersea capability," referring to U.S. submarines. Next. The loss of U.S. conventional deterrence is one thing, but the additional loss of U.S. nuclear deterrence adds a whole other level to the risk of U.S. national security. China currently has an estimated 1,516 nuclear warheads compared to the United States and Russia agreement to only possess 1,550 nuclear warheads each. However, it is assessed that by 2030, China will far surpass the United States with an estimated 4,000 plus nuclear warheads. And in June of 2023, it was reported by the Wall Street Journal that China now possesses more ICBM launchers than the United States. So why is China doing all this? Why are they building a massive modern military and outcompeting the United States across so many domains of war? Next. Recall in the beginning of this presentation where we discussed China's historical view of Chinese primacy as the natural order of things? China is doing all of this because Communist China is already at war with the United States of America and has been for years. The war-weary American public just hasn't realized it yet. With the help of U.S. global corporations, corporate media, and Hollywood, who, at the expense of their own national security, wish to continue to extract large economic profits from the Chinese economy, the second largest economy in the world. In 2019, the most influential and authoritative newspaper in China, called The People's Daily, announced, quote, "The People's War Against America," end of quote. And in November of 22, President Xi created a war cabinet and told them to, quote, "prepare to undergo high winds and waves, and even for the stormy seas of a major test," end of quote. China is even going so far as to influence American children. Next. In 2021, President Xi Jinping sent a letter to 50 U.S. school children in the state of Utah enrolled in a Chinese immersion class. A subsequent video was produced by the school children and showed them referring to the Communist Chinese president as Grandpa Xi and saying, "Stay strong, China." The video was played on internal communist Chinese media such as New China TV and Chinese social media? Is the United States educating its children about the rising threat that is coming from an authoritarian communist Chinese government? Next. In this presentation, we've reviewed Communist China's desire and strategy to overtake the United States globally and subjugate it as a weakened trading partner with no ability to exercise its will throughout the world, while allowing China to shape a new world order that benefits China, not the United States. We have reviewed how China is accomplishing their aggressive goals through the use of unrestricted warfare, eliminated the present need for direct military engagement until the U.S. military becomes weak enough that the Chinese military can dominate it. American citizens, children, and voters need to become more aware of the rising threat to their own national interests and start taking actions to protect themselves against an extremely aggressive communist China set on dominating the world. Next. If you found this presentation helpful, it and many others may be found on the Utah Air National Guard YouTube page. Next. This presentation has an overall security designation of unclassified. Thank you.